This is Duke University.
Welcome to a poetry reading honoring the life and the work of Seamus Heaney. We're delighted that you can be here. It's going to be a simple affair, but I hope an inspiring one. We'll have 8 readers reading from Heaney's poetry, and there'll be a small surprise at the end of it. And rather than spending a great deal of time describing Heaney's life, I only say that, in my own opinion, he's widely regarded as the greatest Irish poet since Yeats. But he may well be the most important poet writing in the English language in the second half of the 20th century and at the beginning of our own. And I would venture to say, and this is perhaps a personal opinion, that he may well be remembered as one of the most important poets in English in the entire tradition. So without more ado, let me present our first reader, one of my colleagues from the English department, Sarah Beckwith, who will be reading 2 poems, Digging and The Underground.
The first poem I'm about to read is called Digging. And of that poem, Seamus Heaney said in a beautiful essay called Feeling into Words, "Digging was the name of the first poem I wrote, where I thought my feelings had got into the words, or to put it more accurately, where I thought my feel had got into the words." He calls it a big, coarse-grained navvy of a poem. Here it is. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground, my father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade. Just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. The second poem is called The Underground. You need to know one thing about this poem, perhaps 2 things. One is that Seamus Heaney travelled to London on his honeymoon with his wife, who he remained married to his wife for 48 years. In the museum tavern on the honeymoon, she got a beet stain on her white going-away dress. The other context of the poem is obviously Orpheus and Eurydice. There we were in the vaulted tunnel running, you in your going-away coat speeding ahead, and me then like a fleet god gaining upon you before you turned to a reed, or some new white flower japped with crimson as the coat flapped wild and button after button sprang off and fell in a trail between the underground and the Albert Hall. Honeymooning, mooning around, late for the proms, our echoes die in that corridor. And now I come as Hansel came on the moonlit stones, retracing the path back, lifting the buttons, to end up in a drafty, lamplit station after the trains have gone, the wet track bared and tensed as I am, all attention for your step following, and damned if I look back. The next speaker is President Richard Broadhead, who is also the William Preston Few Professor of English.
To say that Seamus Heaney is an Irish poet is to say that he comes from a country that has been defined by traditions of violence. And we might say many countries have been defined by traditions of violence, but Ireland, especially during his lifetime, a history of sectarian violence, not the violence of armies against armies, but the much more intimate violence of people who live together by day, and the violence that suddenly intrudes on private life, domestic life, the life of citizens. And so I'm going to read a section from the poem Station Island that is just an uncanny evocation of someone upstairs with his wife. He lives above the shop, as many people do in the British Isles, when all of a sudden violence comes to call. You know that for Heaney, if you've read his Nobel laureate speech, that there is the sense that poetry is written in the presence of and in resistance to violence, or in the presence of the form of humanity expressed in violence, and in testament to the form of humanity expressed instead in poetry. There's only one thing about all the poems I'm going to read. Heaney, like all poets, understands that poetry is about a tradition of language, and that a poet knows how to use a language so that you can get the whole sense of that tradition activated. And if you read this poem, as you hear it, you'll scarcely hear its rhymes, but if you look at it, you'll see how close it is to the terza rima of Dante, and you'll understand that figures appear in this poem just as they materialize and dematerialize in Dante. And you'll recognize the way this poem is like in the Divine Comedy, the way contemporary figures in all their contemporaneity come to you in a poem that nevertheless gestures toward the aspect of eternal things. I'd come to the edge of the water, soothed by just looking, idling over it, as if it were a clear barometer or a mirror, when his reflection did not appear, but I sensed a presence entering into my concentration on not being concentrated as he spoke my name. And though I was reluctant, I turned to meet his face, and the shock is with me at what I saw. His brow was blown open above the eye, and blood had dried on his neck and cheek. Easy now, he said, it's only me. You've seen men as raw as me after a football match. What time it was when I was wakened up, I still don't know, but I heard this knocking, and it scared me, like the phone in the small hours. So I had the sense not to put on the light, but looked out from behind the curtain. I saw two customers at the doorstep, and on their Land Rover with the doors opened, parked on the street. So I let the curtain drop. But they must have been waiting for it to move, for they shouted to come down into the shop. She started to cry then and rolled round the bed, lamenting and lamenting to herself, not even asking who it was. Is your head astray, or what's come over you? I roared, more to bring myself to my senses than out of any real anger at her. For the knocking shook me, the way it kept me up, and her whinging and half screeching made it worse. All the time they were shouting, "Shop, shop." So I put on my shoes and sport coat and went back to the window and called out, "What do you want? Could you quieten the racket, or I'll not come down at all?" "There's a child's not well," says the terrorist as their innocent pretext. "There's a child's not well. Open up and see what you've got, pills or a powder or something in a bottle," one of them said. He stepped back out of the footpath so I could see his face in the street lamp, and when the other moved, I knew them both. But bad and all as the knocking was, the quiet hit me worse. She was quiet herself now, lying dead still, whispering to watch out. At the bedroom door, I switched on the light. It's odd they didn't think to look for a chemist. You remember that chemists in England are pharmacists. It's odd they didn't think to look for a chemist. Who are they anyway at this hour of night? She asked me with the eyes standing in her head. I know to see them, I said, but something made me reach and squeeze her hand across the bed before I went downstairs into the aisle of the shop. I stood there, going weak in the legs. I remember the stale smell of cooked meat or something coming through as I went to open up. From then on, you know as much about it as I do. Now a little colloquy of the poet and this ghost. Did they say nothing? Nothing. What would they say? Were they in uniform, not masked in any way? They were barefaced as they would be in day, shites thinking they were the be-all and end-all. Not that it's any consolation, but they were caught, I told him, and got jail. This is, of course, a huge consolation to ghosts. And now there's just this sense of this living person. He's dead, but the point is he's only real to you because he was once living. Big-limbed, decent, open-faced, he stood forgetful of everything now except what was welling up in his spoiled head, beginning to smile. You've put on a bit of weight since you did your courting in that big Austin you got the loan of on a Sunday night. Through life and death, he had hardly aged, though always was an athlete's cleanliness shining off him, and except for the ravaged forehead and the blood, he was still the same rangy midfielder in the blue jersey and starched pants, the one stylist on our team. The perfect, clean, unthinkable victim. The poet says, "Forgive the way I lived indifferent. Forgive my timid, circumspect involvement," I surprised myself by saying. "Forgive my eye," he said. "All that's way above my head." And then a stun of pain seemed to go through him, and he trembled like a heat wave and faded. So my second poem is another poem in which the language evokes a kind of history of language, and here it's even more complicated. A great friend of Seamus Heaney was the poet Joseph Brodsky, who emigrated from Russia in the early 70s. And when Brodsky died, Heaney read an elegy by him. Actually, I heard Heaney read once upon a time, and this was a new poem at that time. So for me, it's full of the sense of Heaney. But the interesting thing is, Heaney knew that Brodsky had written an elegy for W.H. Auden. And of course, he also knew that Auden had written an elegy for the other great Irish poet, W.B. Yeats. And in this poem, the language, by the time you've heard 4 syllables of it, you know that this is the language that reactivates the memory of Auden's language, that reactivated the memory of Yeats. Yeats was the person who rediscovered Blake, and Blake is the author of this meter par excellence, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night." Okay, and so that's the meter that Auden chose to write this poem about Yeats. "Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry." He died in 1939, so in the middle of the expansion of Nazism, the shadow of the war in Poland, the shadow of World War II, the specter of the Spanish War. And so the death of Yeats and the presence of fascism and the looming World War come together. "In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. Follow, poet, follow right through the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice." And now I stop that poem to start the poem, which is the friend writing for his dead friend in the language of Auden, which was the language of Yeats, and which was the language of Blake, and it's all in there together. What do you need to know about this poem? That Brodsky died on the 28th of January, the same day Yeats had died, okay? You know there's a town in the Arctic Circle in Russia called Arkhangelsk, and you probably don't know that there's a town in Finland called Tampere, but you do remember that Lenin came back to the Russian Revolution by going through the Finland station. "Joseph, yes, you know the beat. Whiston Auden's metric feet march to unstressed and stressed, laying William Yeats to rest. Therefore, Joseph, on this day, Yeats's anniversary, double-crossed and death-marched date, January 28. In measured ways I tread again, quatrain by constrained quatrain, meeting grief and reason out, as you said, a poem ought. Trochee, you know that's the name for this kind of foot, bop, 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 bop. Trochee, falling thus, grief and meter order us. Repetition is the rule, spins on lines we learned at school. Repetition too of cold in the poet and the world, Dublin airport locked in frost, rigor mortis in your breasts. Ice no axe or book will break, no Horatian ode unlock, no poetic foot imprint, quatrain shift or couplet dint. Ice of archangelic strength, ice of this hard two-faced month, ice like Dante's in deep hell, makes your heart a frozen well. Now the poem gets very personal, and if you've ever known Russian emigres who talk too fast and the grammar gets lost along the way, you'll get a sense. Pepper vodka you produced once in western Massachusetts, with the reading due to start, warmed my spirits and my heart. But no vodka, cold or hot, aquavit or whiskey bar brings the blood back to your cheeks, or the color to your jokes, politically incorrect, jokes involving sex and sect, everything against the grain, drinking, smoking like a train in Finland. We talked last summer happily, swapping manuscripts and quips, both of us like cracking whips, sharpened up and making free, heading west for Tampere. West, that meant for you, of course, Lenin's train trip in reverse. Never more that wild speed read, never more your tilted head, like a deck where mind took off with a mind flash and a laugh. Never more that rush to pun or to hurry through all yon jammed enjambments piling up as you went above the top, nose in air, foot to the floor, revving English like a car hijacked when you robbed the bank. Russian was your reserve tank. Worshipped language can't undo damage that time has done to you. Even your peremptory trust in words alone here bites the dust. Dust cake still, see Gilgamesh, feed the dead, so be their guest. Do again what Auden said, good poets do, bite, break the bread. I did not remember that Auden had said that art is the chief means by which we break bread with the dead, but so it turns out to be. And the next reader is, I had all but forgotten, Shannon Potter of the class of 15.
When I first found out about Seamus Heaney's passing, it felt like learning of the death of a distant relative, someone that maybe you didn't see very often, but had lovingly adored from afar. In the days following, having been shook a lot more than I would have expected, I found a lot of comfort in Heaney's own commentary on the nature of death and what might come afterwards in his poetry. And so when I was looking for poems to read today, I turned to his final volume, Human Chain. And the first one I selected was Had I Not Been Awake, as I believe it really exemplifies Heaney's keen observation and awareness of the world around him and his connection to nature and the earth that is shown throughout his writing. Had I not been awake, I would have missed it. A wind that rose and whirled until the roof pattered with quick leaves off the sycamore and got me up. The whole of me a patter, alive and ticking like an electric fence. Had I not been awake, I would have missed it. It came and went so unexpectedly, and almost it seemed dangerously, returning like an animal to the house, a courier blast that there and then lapsed ordinary, but not ever after, and not now. The second poem I selected was Miracle, which references both the story from Mark 2, where Jesus heals a paralyzed man whose friends have carried him in, but also conveys Heaney's experiences and feelings following his stroke. I also believe that it really epitomizes the humility that he showed throughout his life, despite high acclaim across Ireland, across Europe, and across the world. So this is Miracle. Not the one who takes up his bed and walks, but the ones who have known him all along and carry him in. Their shoulders numb, the ache and stoop deep locked in their backs, the stretcher handles slippery with sweat. And no let up until he's strapped on tight, made tiltable and raised to the tiled roof, then lowered for healing. Be mindful of them as they stand and wait, for the burn of the paid-out ropes to cool, their slight lightheadedness and incredulity to pass. Those ones who had known him all along. And our next reader will be Professor Gregson Davis from the Classics Department and Comparative Literature.
I was planning to read an excerpt from Beowulf, but I will do that, but I've decided to add another passage from a different translation by Heaney from Sophocles. So there will be two readings here. Translation is something that's very much on my mind these days because I'm struggling with my own attempts to translate a French Caribbean poet, Aimé Césaire. And so when Michael asked me to contribute, would I be willing to contribute, I said sure, and I immediately thought about Heaney's translations. And so today, I want to read first from a passage from Beowulf, and it speaks for itself. Because we can only judge a translation by reading the original, but these translations stand out as great poems in their own right, obviously, which is why I'm reading it to you today. I'm going to read from the passage in Beowulf where Grendel is making his first attack. And that's from line 702 of the Heaney translation. Then out of the night came the shadow stalker, stealthy and swift. The hall guards were slack asleep at their posts, all except one. It was widely understood that as long as God disallowed it, the fiend could not bear them to his shadow born. One man, however, was in fighting mood, awake and on edge, spoiling for action. In off the moors, down through the mist bands, God-cursed Grendel came greedily loping. I have to read that line again. God-cursed Grendel came greedily loping. The bane of the race of men roamed forth, hunting for a prey in the high hall. Under the cloud murk he moved towards it, until it shone above him, a sheer keep of fortified gold. Nor was that the first time he had scouted the grounds of Hrothgar's dwelling. Although never in his life, before or since, did he find harder fortune or hall defenders. Spurned and joyless, he journeyed on ahead and arrived at the bourne. The iron-braced door turned on its hinge when his hands touched it. Then his rage boiled over. He ripped open the mouth of the building, maddening for blood, pacing the length of the patterned floor with his loathsome tread with a baleful light. Flame more than light flared from his eyes. He saw many men in the mansion sleeping, a ranked company of kinsmen and warriors quartered together, and his glee was demonic, picturing the mayhem. Before morning, he would rip life from limb and devour them, feed on their flesh. But his fate that night was due to change. His days of ravening had come to an end. And what Dick said about violence and as a matrix of poetry is very, very relevant, obviously, in this poem. The other passage, or specimen, if you like, of Heaney's art of translation that I will read comes from his rendition of Greek tragic poetry. I just want to preface my reading of this passage by saying that Heaney and Derek Walcott, the great St. Lucian Martinican poet, were very, very close friends who greatly admired each other's poetry. They shared a deep affinity with ancient Greek literature, especially epic and drama. And Sophocles' great play Philoctetes, featuring the Greek hero with the supposedly incurable, but turned out not to be, wound, who was abandoned by his compatriots on the island of Lemnos on their way to Troy. You all know the plot, I won't repeat it. But Philoctetes provided a motif, a shadow, so to speak, for the figure of Philoctate, the wounded fisherman he was the major protagonist in Walcott's great pseudo-epic Omeros. So here's an excerpt from Heaney's rendition of the scene in Sophocles' play. At the moment when the chorus on the island of Lemnos attempts to persuade him to rejoin the expedition. And he really captures this, very, quite uncanny way, really, I think, the tone and the mood of the chorus. Philoctetes, I should mention also, is the play that I first read in ancient Greek when I was an undergraduate, so I have a very close, I have a great admiration also for the play. So this is Philoctetes in dialogue with the chorus. At this point in the play, he is contemplating suicide. He's been abandoned on the island for years, and so he's contemplating suicide. Philoctetes, have you not a sword for me, or an axe, or something? Chorus, what for? Philoctetes, what for? What do you think for? For foot and head and hand, for the relief of cutting myself off. I want away. Chorus, away where? Philoctetes, away to the house of death, to my father sitting, waiting under the clay roof. I'll come back into him out of the light, out of his memory of the day I left. We'll be on the riverbank again and see the Greeks arriving and me setting out for Troy in all good faith. Chorus, human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a farther shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call miracles self-healing, the utter self-revealing, double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain and lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. It means once in a lifetime that justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. Philoctetes, Hercules, I saw him in the fire. Hercules was shining in the air. I heard the voice of Hercules in my head. And you remember that Philoctetes inherited the bow of Hercules, with which Troy would have to be used in the capture of Troy. Chorus, I have opened the closed road between the living and the dead to make the right road clear to you. I am the voice of Hercules now. Here on earth, my labors were the stepping stones to upper air, lives that suffer and come right are backlit by immortal light. Go, Philoctetes, with this boy. Go and be cured and capture Troy. Asclepius will make you whole, relieve your body and your soul. Follow, poet, follow, right? It's the same meter as that tribute to Yeats. Go, Philoctetes, with this boy. Go and be cured and capture Troy. Asclepius will make you whole, relieve your body and your soul. Go with your bow. Conclude the sore and cruel stalemate of our war. Win by fair combat, but know to shun reprisal killings when that's done. Then take just spoils and sail at last out of the bad dream of your past. Make sacrifice, burn spoils to me, shoot arrows in my memory. But when the city is being sacked, preserve the shrines, show God's respect. Reverence for God survives our individual mortal lives. And on the final comment of the chorus, lyric or remark of the chorus. Now it's high water mark and flood tide in the heart and time to go. The sea nymphs in the spray will be the chorus now. What's left to say? Suspect too much sweet talk, but never close your mind. It was a fortunate wind that blew me here. I leave half ready to believe that a crippled trust might walk, and the half-true rhyme is love.
I'm Joe Donahue, and I want to read 3 poems that are on the theme of transfiguration. The first is The Harvest Bow. As you plaited the harvest bow, you implicated the mellowed silence in you in wheat that does not rust, but brightens as it tightens twist by twist into a knowable corona, a throwaway love knot of straw. Hands that aged around ash plants and cane sticks and lapped the spurs on a lifetime of gamecocks harked to their gift and worked with fine intent until your fingers moved somnambulant. I tell and finger it like braille, gleaning the unsaid off the palpable. And if I spy into its gold loops, I see us walk between the railway slopes into an evening of long grass and midges, blue smoke straight up, old beds and plows and hedges, an auction notice on an outhouse wall. You with a harvest bow in your lapel, me with the fishing rod, already homesick for the big lift of these evenings, as your stick whacking the tips off weeds and bushes, beats out of time and beats, but flushes nothing. That original townland still tongue-tied in the straw tied by your hand. The art of love, the end of art is peace, could be the motto of this frail device that I have pinned up on our deal dresser, like a drawn snare slipped lately by the spirit of the corn, yet burnished by its passage and still warm. I'm going to read several sonnets from a sequence called Crossing. Everything flows, even a solid man, a pillar to himself and to his trade, all yellow boots and stick and soft felt hat, can sprout wings at the ankle and grow fleet as the god of fair days, stone posts, roads and crossroads, guardian of travelers and psychopomp. Look for a man with an ash plant on the boat, my father told his sister setting out for London, and stay near him all night and you'll be safe. Flow on, the journey of the soul with its soul guide and the mysteries of dealing men with sticks. Scissor and slap, abruptness of a latch, in coldness to the thumb, its seesaw lift and drop and innocent harshness, which is a music of binding and of loosing unheard in this generation, but there to be called up or called down as a touch renewed. Once the latch pronounces roof is original again, threshold fatal, the sanction powerful as the foreboding. Your footstep is already known, so bow just a little, raise your right hand, make impulse one with willfulness, and enter. On St. Bridget's Day, the new life could be entered by going through her girdle of straw rope. The proper way for men was right leg first, then right arm and right shoulder, head, then left shoulder, arm, and leg. Women drew it down over the body and stepped out of it. The open they came into by these moves stood opener. Hoops came off the world. They could feel the February air still soft above their heads and imagine the limp rope fray and flare like wind-borne gleanings or an unhindered goldfinch over plowlands. Running water never disappointed. Crossing water always furthered something. Stepping stones were stations of the soul. A kesh could mean the track some called a causey, raised above the wetness of the bog, or the causey where it bridged old drains and streams. It steadies me to tell these things. Also, I cannot mention keshes or the ford without my father's shade appearing to me on a path toward sunset, eyeing spades and clothes that turf cutters stowed perhaps or souls cast off before they crossed the log that spans the burn. And the last poem I'll read is called The Rain Stick. Upend the rain stick, and what happens next is a music that you never would have known to listen for. In a cactus stalk, downpour, sluice rush, spillage, and backwash come flowing through. You stand there like a pipe being played by water. You shake it again lightly, and diminuendo runs through all its scales like a gutter stopping trickling. And now here comes a sprinkle of drops out of the freshened leaves. Then subtle little wets off grass and daisies. Then glitter drizzle, almost breaths of air. Upend the stick again. What happens next is undiminished for having happened once, twice, 10, 1,000 times before. Who cares if all the music that transpires is the fall of grit or dry seeds through a cactus? You are like a rich man entering heaven through the ear of a raindrop. Listen now again. Next reader is Robin Kirk.
I was a fan of Seamus Heaney long before I first went to Northern Ireland, which was in 2008, to look into creating a Duke Engage program there for Duke students. And the book that I carried with me on the airplane was a book of Seamus Heaney's poetry, which was probably the best guidebook you could have to Northern Ireland. I love Heaney. I'm so glad, Gregson, that you read that. I was going between the Curate Troy and this for what I wanted to read. I think that's among the most perfect lines ever written in English. But I chose this poem. It's probably one of Heaney's most topical poems because it really says a lot about the troubles in Northern Ireland, and it's something that my students and I always read every year that we've gone back, which is 4 years now. Just a couple of words, because this is about the troubles. There's some slurs in it, like the word prod, which is the slur for Protestant, and a couple of specific words to the violence in Northern Ireland, like gelignite, which is a kind of explosive. So I'll just start reading. Whatever you say nothing. 1. I'm writing this just after an encounter with an English journalist in search of views of the Irish thing. I'm back in winter quarters where bad news is no longer news, where media men and stringers sniff and point, where zoom lenses, recorders, and coiled leads litter the hotels. The times are out of joint, but I incline as much to rosary beads as to the jottings and analyses of politicians and newspaper men who've scribbled down the long campaign from gas and protest to gelignite and sten, who proved upon their pulses escalate, backlash, and crackdown, the provisional wing, polarization, and long-standing hate. Yet I live here. I live here too. I sing, expertly civil-tongued, with civil neighbors on the high wires of first wireless reports, sucking the fake taste, the stony flavors of those sanctioned, old, elaborate retorts. Oh, it's disgraceful. Surely I agree. Where's it going to end? It's getting worse. They're murderers. Internment, understandably. The voice of sanity is getting hoarse. 2. Men die at hand. In blasted street and home, the Galignite's a common sound effect. As the man said when Celtic won, the Pope of Rome's a happy man this night. His flock suspect, in their deepest heart of hearts, the heretic has come at last to heel and to the stake. We tremble near the flames, but want no truck with the actual firing. We're on the make as ever. Long sucking the hind tit, cold as a witch's and as hard to swallow, still leaves us fork-tongued on the border bit. The liberal papist note sounds hollow when amplified and mixed in with the bangs that shake all hearts and windows day and night. It's tempting here to rhyme on labor pangs and diagnose a rebirth in our plight, but that would be to ignore other symptoms. Last night, you didn't need a stethoscope to hear the eructation of orange drums, allergic equally to Pierce and Pope. On all sides, little platoons are mustering. The phrase is Cruz O'Brien's via that great backlash Burke, while I sit here with a pestering drought for words, at once both gaff and bait, to lure the tribal shoals to epigram and order. I believe any of us could draw the line through bigotry and sham, given the right line, ere perennius. 3. Religions never mentioned here, of course. You know them by their eyes and hold their tongue. One side's as bad as the other, never worse. Christ, it's near time that some small leak was sprung in the great dikes the Dutchmen made to dam the dangerous tide that followed Seamus. Yet for all this art and sedentary trade, I am incapable. The famous northern reticence, the tight gag of place and times, yes, yes, of the wee six I sing, where to be saved you only must save face, and whatever you say nothing. Smoke signals are loud-mouthed compared with us, maneuverings to find out name and school, subtle discrimination by addresses with hardly an exception to the rule. That Norman, Ken, and Sydney signaled prod. And Seamus, call me Sean, was sure-fire pape. O land of password, hand grip, wink and nod, of open minds, as open as a trap, where tongues lie coiled as under flames lie wicks, where half of us, as in a wooden horse, were cabined and confined like wily Greeks, besieged within the siege, whispering Morse. 4. This morning from a dewy motorway, I saw the new camp for the internees. A bomb had left a crater of fresh clay in the roadside, and over in the trees, machine gun posts defined a real stockade. That was what white mist you get on a low ground, and it was déjà vu some film made of Stalag 17, a bad dream with no sound. Is there a life before death? That's chalked up in Ballymurphy. Competence with pain, coherent miseries, a bite and sup. We hug our little destiny again. Now it's Tong Xiang, who is an English major. Yay!
So I love this poem. And sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore in September or October, when the wind and the light are working off each other, so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones, the surface of a slate-gray lake is lit by the earth lightning of a flock of swans, their feathers ruffed and ruffling, white on white, their fully grown, headstrong-looking heads, tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass, as big soft buffetings come of the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. Next we have Professor Michael Moses.
I'm going to read a poem called The Tolan Man, and before I do, I'd like to explain a few facts about it. It's in 3 parts. The subject of the poem, the first of a series of poems called the Bog Poems, is about a bog body exhumed from a bog in contemporary Denmark in the 1950s. It's called the Tolan Man because it was the nearest city or town to the location in which the body was exhumed. Heaney saw a photograph of this preserved body that was nearly 2,000 years old in the work of a Danish archaeologist named P.V. Glob. Glob was called in by the local police to investigate a murder because when this 2,000-year-old body was exhumed, you could still see the fingerprints, the stubble on the chin, and the fact that he had been strangled. In fact, he was a sacrificial victim, sacrificed to the pagan goddess Nerthus during the Iron Age. In the second section of this poem, Heaney compares this photograph to another one, that of 4 brothers who were killed during the Irish War of Independence, approximately 1920, 1921. All killed by the British Black and Tans who were trying to suppress the Irish Rebellion. And the third section is entirely imaginary because it is Heaney thinking of going to Aarhus, the place where the bog body, the Tolan Man, is in fact preserved. All of this, I should mention, takes place within the context of Northern Ireland and its violence in the 1970s, which Heaney, I think, conspicuously does not mention. Someday I will go to Aarhus to see his peat-brown head, the mild pods of his eyelids, his pointed skin cap. In that flat country nearby where they dug him out, his last gruel of winter seeds caked in his stomach, naked except for the cap, noose, and girdle, I will stand a long time. Bridegroom to the goddess, she tightened her torque on him and opened her fen, those dark juices working him to a saint's kept body, trove of the turf cutter's honeycombed workings. Now his stained face reposes at Aarhus. Part 2. I could risk blasphemy, consecrate the cauldron bog, our holy ground, and pray him to make germinate the scattered, ambushed flesh of laborers, stockinged corpses laid out in the farmyards, telltale skin and teeth, flecking the sleepers of 4 young brothers trailed for miles along the lines. Part 3 is referring to the Tolan Man again. Something of his sad freedom as he rode the tumbril should come to me, driving, saying the names Tolan, Graball, Nebelgard, watching the pointing hands of country people, not knowing their tongue. Out there in Jutland, in the old man-killing parishes, I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home. Second poem, once again, combines three distinct images. The first is of a boyhood memory that Heaney has of his mother in front of their house when the coal is being delivered by the local coalman, who is rather conspicuously flirting with his mother and inviting her to go to the movies in the local town, Maherfeld, where she used to go shopping. The second is based on news reports that Heaney received many, many years later, indeed after the death of his mother, about a bombing, an IRA truck bombing that took place in Maherfeld, and in fact damaged many of the buildings that Heaney and his mother would visit when they went shopping. And the final one is an imaginary scene of the ghost of Heaney's mother appearing to him in the very place where the bombing took place. And again, this poem, called Two Laureates, was written not long after Heaney's mother passed away. One final note, and that is that it's constructed like a black and white film from the 1940s. It's raining on black coal and warm, wet ashes. There are tire marks in the yard. Agnew's old lorry has all its cribs down, and Agnew the coal man, with his Belfast accents sweet-talking my mother. Would she ever go to a film in Maherfeld? But it's raining, and he still has half the load to deliver farther on. This time the load our coal came from will silk black, so the ashes will be the silkiest white. The Maherfeld via Tombridge bus goes by. The half-stripped lorry with its empty folded coal bags moves my mother. The tasty ways of a leathern apron coal man. The films, no less. The conceit of a coal man. She goes back in and gets out the black lead and emery paper. This 1940s mother, all business round her stove, half wiping ashes with a backhand from her cheek as the bolted lorry gets revved and turned and heads for Maherfeld and the last delivery. Oh, Maherfeld. Oh, dream of red plush and a city coalman as time fast forwards and a different lorry groans into shot up Broad Street with a payload that will blow the bus station to dust and ashes. After that happened, I had a vision of my mother, a revenant on the bench where I would meet her in the cold-floored waiting room in Maherfeld, her shopping bags full with shoveled ashes. Death walked out past her like a dust-faced coalman, refolding body bags, plying his load, empty upon empty, in a flurry of motes and engine revs. But which lorry was it now? Young Agnew's, or that other, heavier, deadlier one, set to explode in a time beyond her time in Maherfeld? So, tally bags and sweet talk darkness, coalman. Listen to the rain spit in new ashes as you heft a load of dust that was Maherfeld, then reappear from your lorry as my mother's dreamboat coalman filmed in silk-white ashes. I'm going to depart from the program, and rather than read the final poem, we're going to do something a little different. But before I do that, I'd like an opportunity to thank President Broadhead for making this possible, as well as to Carolyn Gerber, who made all the arrangements. And I'd like also to invite you to a reception that will follow this reading, which is going to take place outside on the Bovender Terrace. You'll be directed as you leave if you'd like to go. But we're going to conclude with Heaney himself reading one of the poems from a volume north. The poem is called Funeral Rites. And before we do, I'll just explain that it's an imaginary funeral. He begins with a real one, attending the wakes that he went to as a child, but imagines a funeral cortege extending all the way from the far north in Northern Ireland down across the militarized border between the Republic and Northern Ireland into the southernmost parts, well, not quite, but the southern Ireland, where the ancient tombs of Neolithic peoples existed and exist today at Newgrange. And there he imagines a scene in which all of those killed in the violence will be buried. And they are joined in one of these Neolithic tombs by a figure from the Norse sagas named Gunnar, who was killed in what we might call a blood feud among various clans. But in Heaney's own imaginative transformation of this burial scene, Gunnar, rather than crying for revenge, looks at the moon, and the stone in front of his tomb is rolled away, and he comes forth more like a resurrected Savior calling for peace than a pagan hero calling for vengeance. So, funeral rites.
Funeral rites. I shouldered a kind of manhood, stepping in to lift the coffins of dead relations. They had been laid out in tainted rooms, their eyelids glistening, their dough-white hands shackled in rosary beads. Their puffed knuckles had unwrinkled, the nails were darkened, the wrists obediently sloped. The dulce brown shroud, the quilted satin cribs. I knelt courteously, admiring it all, as wax melted down and veined the candles, the flames hovering to the women hovering behind me. And always in a corner the coffin lid, its nail heads dressed with little gleaming crosses. Dear soapstone masks, kissing their igloo brows had to suffice before the nails were sunk and the black glacier of each funeral pushed away. Now, as news comes in of each neighbourly murder, we pine for ceremony, customary rhythms, the temperate footsteps of a cortege winding past each blinded home. I would restore the great chambers of Boyne, prepare a sepulchre under the cup-marked stones. Out of side streets and by-roads, purring family cars nose into line. The whole country tunes to the muffled drumming of 10,000 engines. Somnambulant women left behind move through emptied kitchens, imagining our slow triumph towards the mounds. Quiet as a serpent in its grassy boulevard, the procession drags its tail out of the gap of the north, as its head already enters the megalithic doorway. When they have put the stone back in its mouth, we will drive north again, past Strang and Carling fjords, the cud of memory allayed for once, arbitration of the feud placated, imagining those under the hill disposed like Gunnar, who lay beautiful inside his burial mound, though dead by violence and unavenged. Men said that he was chanting verses about honour, and that 4 lights burned in corners of the chamber, which opened then, as he turned with a joyful face to look at the moon.
Thank you very much for coming.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.